I was called a dead weight at my own daughter's dinner table, humiliated in front of strangers while she sat there in silence. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It changed. What they didn't know was that everything they thought they controlled was never theirs to begin with. And by the time they realized the truth, it was already too late to take anything back. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Helen Carter. I am 66 years old, a retired high school English teacher, and for the past 3 years, I have been learning how to exist in a life that no longer includes my husband. I still live in the same small house in Portland, Oregon, the one we bought when Lily was just a child. It is not much, but it carries the weight of every memory that ever mattered to me. Most mornings begin the same way. I wake before sunrise, make a cup of coffee, and sit by the kitchen window overlooking my garden. It is not a perfect garden, but it is alive. I tend to it carefully, trimming roses, pulling weeds, trying to preserve something that continues to grow even when everything else feels like it has quietly stopped. After that, I read. Books have always been my refuge, long before I became a teacher, long before I became a mother. Losing my husband did not break me in the way people expected. It hollowed something out. Yes, but it also forced me to stand on my own in a way I had not done in decades. We had built a life together based on steady routines and quiet understanding. When he was gone, I did not collapse. I adjusted, or at least, I told myself that I did. Lily used to be the center of my world. When she was little, she followed me everywhere, asking questions, telling stories, needing reassurance. I remember the way she would reach for my hand without thinking, as if it was simply part of her. Even as she grew older, there was always a closeness between us that felt unbreakable. That began to change after she married Daniel Brooks. Daniel is the kind of man people admire at first glance. He is confident, successful in real estate, always speaking with certainty. He has a way of entering a room that makes people listen. But over time, I began to notice something beneath that surface. He does not see people the way others do. He evaluates them, measures them, decides quietly what they are worth. He has never openly insulted me, not in a way anyone could easily point to, but there have been moments, a sigh when I ask a simple question, a look when I take a little too long to understand something new, comments about how things are different now, or how the world moves faster than it used to, always subtle, always deniable. At first, Lily would gently push back. She would smile, change the subject, sometimes even defend me. But gradually, those moments faded. She began to stay quiet. Then she began to agree, not directly, but in small ways that felt heavier than words. A nod, a quick glance, a silence that stretched just a little too long. I told myself it was normal. People grow up. They build new lives. Priorities shift. I repeated those thoughts often enough that they almost sounded like truth. But there were evenings when I sat alone in my living room, the house too quiet, and I could not ignore the feeling that I was slowly becoming something else in their lives. Not a mother, not even family in the way I used to be. Something closer to an obligation. Still, when Lily invited me to her birthday dinner, I said yes without hesitation. I baked her favorite cake, just like I always had. As I wrapped it carefully and prepared to leave, I felt something I had not felt in a while. Hope. And beneath it, something quieter. A sense that something had already begun to shift, whether I was ready to face it or not. Lily's house sat at the edge of a newly developed neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, where every home looked polished and deliberate, as if designed to impress rather than to be lived in. I arrived earlier than most, carrying the cake I had baked that morning, carefully boxed and tied with a ribbon I found in one of my kitchen drawers. For a moment, standing at the front door, I felt like I used to when Lily was a child preparing for a school recital, hopeful, a little nervous, but certain I belonged there. Inside, everything was already arranged. The dining table was set with precision, glassware reflecting the soft overhead lights, and a faint scent of catered food drifted through the room. This was not the kind of gathering I used to host. It was sharper, more curated. I handed Lily the cake, and she thanked me quickly, her smile warm but fleeting, already turning her attention to something else. Guests began arriving soon after. Most of them were Daniel's colleagues, men and women dressed in tailored clothes, speaking easily about property values, market shifts, and deals closing in cities I had only visited once or twice. Their conversations moved quickly, filled with terms that felt distant from the life I knew. I stood among them, listening more than speaking, holding a glass of water I barely touched. Daniel moved through the room like it belonged to him entirely. He greeted people with confidence, laughed loudly, and commanded attention without asking for it. When he spoke, others leaned in. I noticed the way he introduced me to one of his associates, his tone polite but thin, as if I were a detail rather than a person. It was subtle, something no one else would question, but I felt it all the same. Lily floated between rooms, making sure everyone was comfortable, but she rarely stayed beside me for long. Each time our eyes met, there was something unspoken there, something she seemed unwilling to address. I told myself she was simply busy, that hosting required attention, but the distance felt deliberate. Dinner began with quiet conversation and the clinking of silverware against plates. I kept my focus on the simple act of eating, aware of the conversations rising and falling around me. Daniel had already refilled his wine glass more than once. His voice grew louder, his gestures broader. I had seen this before, though never in such a public setting. At some point, he stood up, lifting his glass. The room gradually quieted. It seemed like an ordinary moment, the kind that marks celebrations. I expected something light, maybe a joke, maybe a compliment for Lily. Instead, his gaze shifted toward me. His words came out sharp and unmistakable. "Dead weight. You ruined your daughter's life." He followed it with a slow, deliberate clap, as if punctuating his own performance. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. It lasted only a few seconds before it fractured into uneasy laughter from a couple of guests who did not know where else to place their discomfort. No one spoke directly to me. No one corrected him. I turned to Lily. She did not meet my eyes. She stared at the table, her hands still, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. In that moment, something inside me did not break. It stilled. The shock settled into a kind of clarity I had not felt in a long time. I realized this was not an accident, not a single lapse in judgment. It was the truth, spoken out loud. I placed my bag gently on the table beside me, my movements calm and deliberate. I could feel every pair of eyes shifting, uncertain now, waiting. For the first time that evening, I was not the one adjusting to the room. Something had already begun to change. The silence that followed Daniel's words did not disappear. It settled over the room like a weight. pressing into every corner, forcing people to choose between acknowledging what had just happened or pretending it had not. Most chose the second option. A few guests lowered their eyes to their plates. Others reached for their glasses, as if movement alone could dissolve the tension. I did not move immediately. I let the silence exist. For years, I had learned how to adjust myself to fit into moments like this, to soften discomfort, to redirect attention. But something in me had shifted. I was no longer interested in making anyone else feel at ease. My hands were steady as I reached for my bag. It rested beside my chair, ordinary in appearance, holding something none of them expected. I opened it slowly, not as a gesture of defiance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made a decision long before this night began. Inside was a folder, thick, organized, deliberate. I placed it on the table. The sound was soft, but it carried. Conversations that had started to rise again faded once more. I could feel their attention returning, this time not guided by Daniel, but by me. I slid the folder open and turned the first document toward the center of the table. The paper was crisp, the formatting unmistakably legal. I did not rush to explain it. I let them look, let them wonder. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, more focused. He recognized enough to understand that this was not casual. Lily's posture shifted as well. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table, her expression no longer distant, but alert. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured, and far quieter than his had been. This was prepared before my husband passed away. That was all I said at first. I watched as the meaning began to form in their minds. Daniel's eyes moved across the page, scanning for context. Lily glanced between me and the document, trying to connect what she was seeing with what she thought she knew. I continued, giving them exactly what they needed to understand. It is a trust. The word changed everything. Even without details, it carried weight. Conversations about real estate and investments had filled the room all evening. They all knew what a trust meant. Daniel's posture straightened, but not with confidence. It was calculation now. Lily's face lost what little color it had left. It names Lily as the beneficiary. I could feel the shift ripple outward. The guests who had tried to distance themselves earlier were now fully present, drawn in despite themselves. The room no longer belonged to Daniel's voice. It had narrowed, focused. Daniel's gaze moved quickly, searching for the number. When he found it, I saw the exact moment recognition turned into realization. I did not need to say it, but I did. It is valued at just over $1.2 million. The air seemed to thin. No one laughed this time. No one pretended this was something small. I let the silence return, but it was different now. It carried awareness. Then I added what mattered most. It has conditions. I did not elaborate immediately. I watched them absorb that single word. Daniel's expression tightened further, his mind already moving ahead, trying to anticipate what those conditions might mean. Lily looked at me directly for the first time that evening, her eyes searching, uncertain. I met her gaze without hesitation. The trust requires that I am treated with respect, care, and consideration, consistently. I paused, letting each word settle, and I retained full authority to revoke it. This time the silence did not feel heavy. It felt precise. For the first time in a very long time, I was not the one being evaluated. They were. The next morning began like any other, at least on the surface. I woke before sunrise, moved through my kitchen in quiet familiarity, and poured myself a cup of coffee. The house was still, the kind of stillness that had once felt lonely, but now felt steady. Outside, the early light touched the edges of my garden, soft and indifferent to everything that had happened the night before. The first call came at 6:15. I let it ring, then another and another, each one closer together, each one carrying a sense of urgency that did not belong to me. By the time the clock reached 7, my phone had lit up more times than it had in the past month combined. Lily's name, Daniel's name, alternating, repeating, insisting. I sat at the table and took a slow sip of coffee, watching the screen go dark between calls. For years, I would have answered immediately. I would have tried to smooth things over, to make space for explanations, to protect the fragile idea of family. That instinct was still there somewhere, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, I let the silence hold. With each unanswered call, something became clearer. What had happened the night before was not a single moment of poor judgment. It was the visible edge of something that had been building for months, perhaps longer. I began to replay those moments in my mondangi, not as isolated incidents, but as a pattern I had chosen not to see. The way Daniel would sigh when I asked for help with something new, the way he would correct me in front of others, framing it as patience, the way Lily would remain quiet, her silence stretching longer each time until it became its own kind of agreement. When I finally answered, it was not out of obligation. It was because I had already decided how I felt. Daniel's voice came through quickly, too quickly, as if he had been waiting at the edge of the call. It carried urgency, apology, and something else beneath it that was harder to name but easier to recognize. He spoke about the night before, about how it had gone too far, about how he had been under pressure. The explanation moved in circles, never quite settling, always reaching for something that would make it sound temporary. I listened, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to understand what had changed, or rather, what had not. As he spoke, I found myself remembering the small details he seemed to forget. The day at the bank when he had raised his voice because I hesitated at the machine. The afternoon he dismissed my questions about a new phone as if they were inconveniences. The quiet conversations I had overheard, where concern was framed as limitation. None of those moments had been loud, none of them had drawn attention, but together they formed something unmistakable. When he shifted to speaking about family, the word felt hollow. It arrived too late, shaped by necessity rather than meaning. I could hear the strain in his voice, the way it tightened when he tried to sound sincere. In the background, I thought I heard Lily, not speaking, just present, like an echo of something unresolved. I ended the call without raising my voice, without needing to argue. There was nothing left to negotiate. 20 minutes later, I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I saw Daniel step out, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. He moved quickly toward the door, his posture tense, his movements sharp with urgency. The knocking began almost immediately. I did not move to answer. I stayed where I was, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, listening as his voice carried through the door. The words sounded different now, shaped into apologies, into promises, into something that might have resembled regret if it had come sooner. But it had not. I could hear the difference. It was not remorse, it was fear, and for the first time I understood that clearly. 3 days passed before Lily came to see me alone. In those days, the phone had quieted, the urgency fading into something more cautious, more calculated. I did not expect the silence to last, only to change its shape. I was in the garden when I heard the gate open. The morning air carried the faint scent of damp soil and roses that had begun to bloom earlier than usual this year. I knelt beside one of the bushes, trimming away the dead edges, focusing on something that responded to care in ways people no longer seemed to. I did not turn around immediately. I knew it was her. Her footsteps slowed as she approached, hesitant, as if unsure whether she still belonged in this space. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distance between us felt unfamiliar, though it had been growing for some time. When I finally stood, I faced her without expression. She looked different, not in any obvious way, but in the small details that revealed strain. Her posture was tight, her eyes shadowed, her composure thinner than I had ever seen it. This was not the version of Lily who hosted polished dinners and moved easily through conversations. This was something closer to the child she used to be, uncertain and searching. She tried to bridge the distance with a softness that felt practiced, but not entirely false. I listened, but I did not step forward. There was a pause, and then she said it. She had known. The words did not land like a shock. They settled into place, confirming something I had already begun to suspect. Still, hearing them spoken carried a different weight. It shifted everything from assumption into certainty. She explained quickly, as if speed might soften the meaning. She had found the documents months ago, hidden among old papers. She had not told me. She had not told Daniel. She had waited. Her reason was simple, at least in the way she presented it. She wanted to see who Daniel truly was. She did not want him to change his behavior just because of money. She wanted authenticity. I let her speak. As she talked, I felt the pieces align in a way that was almost too clear. Every moment I had dismissed, every hesitation, every silence, took on a new shape. This had not been confusion. It had been a decision. She had chosen to watch. In doing so, she had allowed everything else to continue. The comments, the dismissals, the quiet agreement that followed each one. What she described as patience now felt like permission. I thought about the times she had framed concern as practicality, the suggestions that I simplify my life, that I avoid certain things, that I accept limitations I had not claimed for myself. I had heard those words and told myself they came from care. Now I understood where they had been learned. Her voice began to break as she tried to explain further. There was regret in it, but also fear. Not just fear of losing me, but fear of what that loss would mean in every sense. I did not interrupt. I watched her struggle with the weight of what she had done, and for a moment, I saw both versions of her at once. The child who had once trusted me completely, and the woman who had chosen silence when it mattered most. The distance between those two versions was something I could not close. When I finally spoke, it was not to argue or to accuse. It was simply to state what had become undeniable. Love is not something that exists in thought alone. It is measured in what we choose to do, especially when it is difficult. She lowered her eyes, unable to hold my gaze. In that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding. This was not just about Daniel. This was about her. The garden had never felt so still. Even the faint rustle of leaves seemed distant, as if the world itself had stepped back to give space to what was unfolding between us. Lily stood a few feet away, her hands clasped together, her posture uncertain. The air between us carried everything that had already been said, and everything that could no longer be undone. She shifted first. The softness in her expression remained, but there was a new urgency beneath it. I could see her searching for a way forward, something that would repair what had already fractured. She began to speak again, not about the past, but about solutions. She suggested that I should not be living alone anymore. At first, the words were framed gently. It would be easier, she explained, safer, more practical. She spoke of convenience, of support, of making things simpler for me. But as she continued, the structure of her plan became clearer. She wanted me to move into her house. She described how they could prepare a room for me, how everything would be arranged so I would not have to worry about daily responsibilities. She mentioned selling my home, as if it were a logical step, something expected rather than questioned. Her tone carried a quiet certainty, as though this was not a proposal, but an inevitable transition. I listened without interrupting. Each detail she offered revealed more than she intended. What she described as care felt carefully organized, efficient, controlled. It was a life where decisions would be made for me, not with me. A life where independence would be replaced with supervision. I looked past her words and saw the pattern forming. This was not sudden. It was the natural progression of everything that had come before. The subtle dismissals, the quiet agreements, the gradual reframing of who I was becoming in their eyes. Not a person with agency, but a responsibility to be managed. She paused, waiting. I did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but necessary. I needed to feel the weight of what she was asking, to understand it fully before responding. In that pause, something settled inside me. If I agreed, I would not be moving into a new home. I would be surrendering the last parts of myself that still belonged entirely to me. When I finally spoke, my voice remained steady. I will not do that. The words did not rise or fall. They simply existed, clear and final. She looked at me as if she had not heard correctly. The certainty she had carried began to falter. I could see confusion first, then disbelief. She had expected hesitation, perhaps even resistance, but not refusal. I held her gaze. What she was offering was not care. It was control, shaped in a way that made it easier to accept. But I could see it now, too clearly to ignore. There was something else she did not know. I told her, carefully, without raising my voice, that Daniel had already begun asking questions, not directly to me, but to others, to doctors, to professionals who could evaluate whether I was capable of living independently. He had been gathering information, preparing for something that went beyond concern. Her expression shifted again, this time sharper. Shock, confusion, a flicker of something that might have been denial. She had not known the full extent of it, but she had allowed the environment where it could happen. That was enough. I stepped back, not physically, but in a way that changed everything. The path in front of me was no longer uncertain. It was clear, even if it meant walking it alone. If you're still watching and feel the tension rising toward a breaking point, comment number 6 below so I know you're still with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. I left Portland before sunrise, the sky still dim and undecided, as if it had not yet chosen what kind of day it wanted to become. The drive to Seattle had always been familiar, something my husband and I used to do together years ago, but this time it felt different. There was no conversation, no shared silence, only the steady rhythm of the road and the clarity that had been forming inside me since that night. By the time I reached the city, the morning had settled into a muted gray. The law office stood in a quiet part of downtown, a building that did not try to impress, but carried a sense of permanence. Inside, everything was orderly, deliberate, untouched by the kind of emotional turbulence I had been living through. Sitting across from the attorney, I realized how long it had been since I had spoken about my life in the terms that required precision instead of feeling. I explained the situation without embellishment. The dinner, the conversations that followed, the proposal to move me out of my home, the information I had uncovered about Daniel's actions behind the scenes. I spoke calmly, not because it was easy, but because the facts no longer needed emotion to carry them. He listened carefully, occasionally noting details, but never interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, as if reviewing something already familiar. What he confirmed did not surprise me, but it grounded everything. The trust had been structured to give me full authority, not partial, not conditional, absolute. The language was clear, designed to ensure that the intention behind it could not be easily challenged or reinterpreted. My role was not symbolic, it was decisive. Hearing that removed any remaining uncertainty. There was no legal ambiguity, no gray area I needed to navigate. The decision was mine entirely. Then he shared something else. Daniel and Lily were under significant financial strain. Investments that had once seemed promising had failed to produce the returns they expected. Loans had accumulated, pressure had increased, and their financial position was far more unstable than they had allowed anyone to see. I listened without reacting outwardly, but the connection formed immediately. The urgency, the shift in tone, the sudden concern for my well-being. It had never been about me. It had been about survival. Every conversation I had questioned, every moment I had tried to interpret generously, now aligned with a different kind of logic. What I had once considered misunderstanding was, in reality, strategy. He also mentioned that Daniel had reached out with questions, not directly to me, but through channels that suggested a search for alternatives, possibilities, ways to challenge or bypass the structure of the trust. The pattern was consistent. Daniel was not reconsidering his behavior. He was recalculating his options. That realization settled into me without resistance. There was no anger in it, only recognition. It clarified something I had been slowly accepting. Lily had not created this situation, but she had allowed it to continue. Each silence, each moment of agreement, had shaped the path that brought us here. Influence explained part of it, but it did not remove responsibility. When I stood to leave, the city outside looked unchanged. People moved along the sidewalks, focused on their own routines, unaware of the quiet decision that had just taken form in a room above them. As I walked back to my car, I understood that what lay ahead would not be easy, but it would be clear. For the first time, I was not reacting to what others expected of me. I was choosing. When I returned to Portland, the house felt different. Nothing had changed physically. The same quiet rooms, the same worn kitchen table, the same garden outside my window. But something inside me had shifted, and it altered the way everything else settled around me. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like something I had to endure. It felt like something I had chosen. I set my keys down and stood in the center of the living room, letting the stillness settle. This house had held every version of my life. A young wife learning routines, a mother raising a child, a widow learning how to exist again. It was not just a place. It was the last space where I was entirely myself. I was not going to give that up. Later that afternoon, I went to the small wooden drawer in my bedroom. Inside, among old letters and photographs, was something I had not opened in years. The envelope was worn at the edges, the handwriting familiar in a way that never faded. I sat down before unfolding it. The words were simple, but they carried the steadiness I had relied on for most of my life. He had written about strength, not as something loud or visible, but as something quiet that endured when everything else shifted. He reminded me, in his way, that I was never meant to disappear into someone else's expectations, that I had a life beyond roles, beyond obligations. I read it slowly, letting each sentence settle where it needed to. By the time I folded it again, I was no longer searching for confirmation. I had it. What I was about to do was not an act of anger, it was an act of alignment. The next morning, I called the attorney. There was no hesitation in my voice as I explained what I wanted. The process was already prepared. The trust could be revoked, the terms enforced exactly as written. All that remained was my decision. I gave it. The funds would not go to Lily. They would be transferred to an organization that supported older women who had been pushed aside, overlooked, or reduced to something less than who they were. It was not something I had planned from the beginning, but it felt right in a way I did not need to question. I was not taking something away. I was placing it somewhere it would matter. Within days, the paperwork was set in motion. Quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. There was no announcement, no confrontation, just a series of decisions that moved forward without needing approval from anyone else. Daniel responded exactly as I expected. He reached out through legal channels, asking questions that were not about understanding, but about finding a way around what had already been decided. The approach was structured, deliberate, and entirely predictable. What he did not expect was that I had prepared as well. The documentation I had kept over time, the recordings, the records of behavior that had once seemed unnecessary to hold on to, now carried weight. I did not use them aggressively. I did not need to. Their existence alone was enough to establish a pattern that could not be dismissed. His position weakened before it could fully form. The challenge did not disappear entirely, but it lost its momentum, and with that, something else settled into place. That evening, I returned to my usual seat by the window. The garden outside was beginning to shift with the season, small changes that only became visible when you paid close attention. I watched the light fade slowly, the quiet deepening without discomfort. I was alone, but I was not diminished. For the first time in years, I felt something I had not expected to feel again. Freedom. If you're still here and ready to see how everything finally comes together, comment number 8 below to stay with me. Now, let's move on to the final outcome of this story. By the time the season shifted, everything that had been set in motion had found its way to a conclusion. The garden outside my window had changed again, the early blooms giving way to deeper colors, the air carrying a quieter kind of warmth. It was the kind of change that happened gradually, without announcement, yet unmistakable once it settled. My days had become steady. I woke early, tended to the garden, read in the afternoons, and allowed the hours to pass without pressure. There was no longer a sense of waiting, no quiet expectation that something unresolved might return. What had needed to happen had already happened. I did not hear about Daniel and Lily directly. The information came in fragments, passed along through acquaintances who still felt the need to inform me, as if I were meant to respond in some way. Daniel's business had begun to collapse under the weight of debt that could no longer be managed. Partnerships dissolved, opportunities disappeared, and the confidence that had once defined him turned into something far less certain. Lily's situation followed closely behind. Without the structure she had relied on, her life shifted quickly. The stability she once moved through so easily was gone, replaced by something less predictable. I was told she had distanced herself from Daniel, though the details were unclear. It did not matter in the way it once might have. When I first heard these things, I expected to feel something stronger. Relief, satisfaction, even regret. Instead, what I felt was quiet. There was a moment, brief and passing, where I allowed myself to think of her not as she had been recently, but as the child she once was. That version of Lily still existed somewhere in my memory, untouched by the choices that had followed. I felt a trace of sadness for that loss, but it did not linger. What had unfolded was not something I had created. It was something that had revealed itself. The reactions from extended family were less subtle. I was described as unforgiving, distant, unwilling to repair what had been broken. The words carried judgment, but they also carried a distance I no longer needed to bridge. Their concern had appeared only after the outcome became visible, not when the behavior that led to it was taking place. That difference mattered. In time, I made a decision that had nothing to do with leaving something behind and everything to do with moving forward. I relocated to Santa Barbara, California. The change was immediate in ways that were difficult to describe. The ocean stretched outward in a way that made everything else feel smaller, more manageable. The rhythm of the place was different, less hurried, less concerned with constant motion. I found myself drawn into a community without effort. There were women there who carried stories similar to mine, each shaped differently, but rooted in the same quiet realization that they had been expected to disappear into roles that no longer fit. We spoke, not always about the past, but about what came next. For the first time in years, I felt connected without being defined by obligation. I did not wait for Lily to reach out. I did not close the door to the possibility, but I no longer stood beside it. Some things remain, even when everything else changes, and some things, once lost, do not need to be recovered to understand their meaning. The evenings in Santa Barbara had a way of slowing everything down. The light lingered longer over the horizon, stretching across the ocean in soft layers that changed color with every passing minute. I had grown used to sitting near the window as the day faded, not thinking about what had been, but allowing space for what remained. There was a quiet rhythm to my life now. Not the kind built around obligation or expectation, but one shaped by choice. Each day felt intentional, even in its simplicity. I no longer measured my worth through the roles I had once carried. I existed without needing to prove anything to anyone. And yet, there were moments when the past returned, not as something unresolved, but as something that needed to be acknowledged one final time. That was what led me to the letter. I did not write it out of longing, nor out of regret. I wrote it because there were truths that deserved to exist beyond silence. I sat at the small desk by the window, the ocean visible just beyond the glass, and let the words come slowly. I thought about Lily, not as she had been in those final months, but as she once was. The child who trusted me without hesitation. The young woman who once believed that love meant safety. That version of her was still part of the story, even if it no longer defined the present. What I wrote was simple. Love is not something that exists quietly in the background. It is not proven through intention alone. It is shown through action, especially in moments when speaking up is difficult. Respect is not something that can be delayed or negotiated. It is either present or it is not. I wrote that silence has consequences. That choosing not to defend someone you care about is still a choice. And that over time, those choices shape who we become, whether we intend them to or not. There was no anger in what I wrote, no attempt to assign blame or reopen what had already been closed, only clarity. When I finished, I read the letter once more, not to revise it, but to understand it. The words reflected something I had come to accept fully. I could not control whether she would understand. I could not decide how she would respond, or if she would respond at all. And for the first time, that uncertainty did not trouble me. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. The act itself felt complete, not because it would change anything, but because it no longer needed to. Family, I had learned, is not defined by proximity or history alone. It is defined by the way people choose to treat one another, consistently, without condition. I am no longer waiting to be seen. I am no longer adjusting myself to fit into spaces where I am not valued. I am Helen Carter, and I understand now what love really means. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing what truly matters. Respect cannot be borrowed, love cannot survive in silence, and dignity is not something to be negotiated. There comes a moment when choosing peace means letting go, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to walk away from what diminishes you and stand firmly in your own worth. When that choice is made, something shifts. What once felt like loss becomes space, and in that space, something new begins to grow. If this story reached you in any way, thank you for staying until the end. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you would like more stories like this, do not forget to follow and subscribe.